So I was thinking a lot today about when I was peak tranced.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it feels like it's been a long time. You know, a lot of people sort of say that like the whole trans ideology really took off at the not the Caitlyn Jenner, but even before that, when Time magazine had Laverne Cox on their cover and it said the transgender tipping point. And I think the article
Yeah.
was about how this is the next human rights frontier that is now that we're at the tipping point where it's being respected and it's being valued as a human right, and people are actually learning what all the lingo means and everything. And that was right around the time that I was peak tranced. It was all around that. Do you remember when you were peak tranced?
Yeah. So do you remember what year it was that Laverne Cox article came out?
Sure. So the transgender tipping point with Laverne Cox, Time magazine, was May 29th, 2014.
Wow, it was earlier than I would have expected.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were ahead of me then in terms of being gender critical, because in 2014, I was definitely more on the lib fem, like trans activist side of it. I'm embarrassed to say that I was actually working at a women's organization where we were doing things for women and girls. And I was the one who was saying things like, we need to be inclusive of non-binary people and, that kind of thing. So at that point, I was like, totally on board. And it wasn't until a couple years later, closer to 2017, I think, that I really started to think critically about it. So for me, what really tipped me over the edge was actually a conversation that I had with my partner about Rachel Dolezal. And Rachel Dolezal happened, I think, a couple years actually prior to when this conversation had happened. I think she was around like 2015 or so, and this conversation was maybe in 2017. But for some reason, we were, talking about her again. Maybe she was back in the news for some latest drama.
Right.
And
maybe when her parents showed those pictures of her as a kid where she's like this little blonde kid.
Yeah, it was something like that. But, there was some conversation sparked about her. And my partner, Alex, had said something along the lines of, honestly, like, I don't really get what the big deal is. If transgender is a thing, then why can't transracial be a thing? And I was like, oh, that's so offensive and racist. Like, you can't say that. And he was like, but why? Like, why is it not the same? And he wasn't gender critical at this point. It was almost the other direction. Like, he wanted to be more accepting of like anyone's identities.
Mm-hmm.
But in this conversation, I was like arguing some points with him. I realized, okay, I don't really know the answers to these points, so let me go look it up. Like, let me go educate myself.
Yeah.
So I went on YouTube and I looked up Kat Black, who is a trans YouTuber who is also Black. And Kat was explaining the difference between transgender and transracial and
did
why.
Did you already know Kat Black? Like, had you watched her? Okay, got you. So you were like,
I was a
fan
of.
Let me go to this source and get some info.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Yes, like, let me educate myself. Yeah. So I was watching this video, and as I was watching it, just like point by point, I was realizing, wait, I don't agree with that. Wait, I don't agree with that. Wait, that's not true. That's not true about women. That's not true about sex. Like, no, that doesn't apply the way that you're saying those things apply. And I had this like huge moment of cognitive dissonance where I was like, oh, wait, maybe I don't agree with this. And so then I kind of like sat on that feeling for a while. I started looking things up online because I was in, trans, like, inclusive circles, like very liberal feminist circles where, we would share pronouns and everything. And so like, this was an issue I was very familiar with. So I knew what a TERF was, and I knew I absolutely could not be one of those. And so I actually, when I started to question all this stuff, I think I like literally Googled, like, am I a TERF? And that brought me to the Our Gender Critical subreddit, where I then realized, like, oh, like, this is a misnomer. Like, oh, this is an offensive term. Like, oh, like, here's all of these other different, like, thoughts about gender identity, like, coming from other people who are also leftists, who are also liberals, who are also critical of gender as a whole and not from a, necessarily conservative point of view, other feminists. And that's when I realized, like, okay, I'm not alone in this idea. Like, I'm not just some crazy person thinking that this is all wrong. And that was kind of what piqued me, is this conversation with my partner.
What happened after that? You had the cognitive dissonance. Like, where did that lead you?
My whole life fell apart, and we are here now.
And that's not even
that's
a
the short
joke.
version. Yeah. So basically what happened was I went back to my partner after sitting on these ideas for a few months and like forming some sort of theory and like feminist analysis on my own, and like doing lots of research and reading. Then a few months later, I went back to him and I said, like, hey, I want to talk to you about this. Like, I think I might be like a TERF, and I think that I like am critical of this kind of stuff now. And at that point, I still didn't have like the words that I would maybe use today, but I knew more about it after a few months of research. And he at first was really opposed to this idea because, you know, it was like, that's not what we're supposed to be. I was living at the time in a like kind of animal rights commune sort of thing. And so there were like 6 or so of us who were all animal rights activists. It's a very liberal, very leftist, you know, anarcho-communist sort of vibe there. And these ideas were just not welcome. But he listened to me and he let me say my piece. And he said, I think that's really bigoted, but I love you. And so like, I'm going to go do some research and think about it.
Wow.
And then he did. He went and did some research, the same as me. And then a few months later came back and said, hey, so I think I'm a TERF too. and that was
modern day love
like
story.
How, but then after that, we together were kind of just like sitting on this like secret that was eating us apart inside, that like the world is kind of like swirling around us and all this like gender identity stuff all the time. And before, I never felt like I noticed it so much, but then all of a sudden, like everything seemed like I could see these parallels in our activism of like ways that this was influencing our activism and things that I didn't agree with anymore. But then really what ended up happening was eventually we just could not keep what we saw to be reality under wraps anymore. Yeah. And one by one, in little instances, we started making critical comments like, oh, I don't really think that we should start doing these pronoun circles at our meetings anymore because it's actually really regressive in a way. And like, you know, we tried to frame it in a way that was approachable, but in the end, it just kind of eventually spiraled to the point where the whole community considered us TERFs and therefore hateful. And we were essentially pushed out of the animal rights community, including our house and, you know, including like separation from some of the animals that we had taken care of. And so we really ended up being like totally segregated from that whole community when it became clear that we believe you know, females biologically exist as a meaningful class, and it's called women.
Was that the hardest thing, would you say? Like that sort of like emotional, personal separation from people, from animal, from pets, you know?
Yeah, from all of the people, human and non-human people. Yeah. But honestly, what happened with my friends was really devastating to me because, I mean, these women who I lived with were my best friends. I mean, I loved them. Like, they were, you know, who I spent 24 hours a day with. We were doing like really serious direct action during the day, putting our lives on the line sometimes to do some of these actions that are not entirely legal. And so we were, you know, really bonded over some of the organizing and activism that we were doing. And then we would go home and like party and hang out and bond and tell our stories of like trauma and stuff together. And so the fact that they decided that they can no longer be friends with me because my feminism changed, that was really devastating to me. It really had an impact, I think, on my ability to trust people for a while.
Wow. Yeah. I also felt like, you know, once I kind of realized all this stuff, I didn't feel like I could trust the same people quite as much in the same way. Mine wasn't nearly as dramatic as yours, though, because I kind of went through it on a way more just purely internal level. I was kind of like a lurker with gender critical stuff for years. I just read about it and I didn't contribute anything of my own voice. But although I did try to talk about it to people in real life, and that never went really that well. But well, unless they were also secretly thinking these things, in which case it was wonderful. But
Yeah.
it's funny that you said you went to Cat Black to try to learn more and to get the right answers, because I remember that I was so I had just started university, and we'd had to do the thing where you say your pronouns. This was all brand new. You know, I'm 25, so I'm right at the age where we didn't have any of this gender theory whatsoever when I was in high school. It started right around when I started college. And so I was totally on board. I was like, we should all say our pronouns to make people feel more comfortable if they have to say other pronouns. But then, of course, I learned, well, actually, that's problematic, because what if they're still in the closet? Okay, so that's something right there where the rules keep changing and the lines keep changing. But for me, I was watching interviews and lectures by Laverne Cox and Janet Mock. Do you remember Janet Mock?
Yes, I do.
And I was totally on board with her and Laverne Cox. I was learning from them. I remember even when Laverne Cox said, I have come to learn that misgendering is a form of violence, right? She said that. I was trying to understand that. I didn't immediately reject it. But then I saw that Tumblr post, and it was, you know, it said, why do trans women only want to be hot women? They only want to be the idea of what men find fuckable. Then I had that in my mind while I was seeing Laverne Cox, who has like the bolt-on tits, the stilettos, the skinny dresses, you know, mini dresses, ton of makeup and hair and everything. And in my mind, it was like, well, is that what makes a woman, or is that the male sort of, you know, fetishistic idea of what a woman is? And then it just clicked into place, like, well, wait a second, if a trans woman is actually a male, is born, because at that point I'm like, they're born a male, then that means that they had that male mindset, and they had it when they created this Barbie. And then I just could never unsee it. That was what it was for me. It was just like, those are the accoutrements of femininity that I've been raised to think don't really matter. I wasn't raised to be girly. My mom is super progressive, and she doesn't wear like dresses, makeup, and stuff like that. And she didn't ever put me into it. If you see pictures of me as a kid, I'm wearing like what my brother's wearing, and probably his old clothes actually. But yeah, that was what did it for me. And then, you know, since then I've done so much thinking on it, and some of the stuff has made me really fucking angry, like really angry. Like when I hear, there was just recently an interview with a trans woman on a podcast. She was asked about teenage girls who transition and then regret it, right? Like they get mastectomies, they remove their breasts. And then she said basically flippant, like, oh, well, you know, well, they can just get breasts again later if they want them. That's the type of thing that makes my blood boil. And that's the type of thing that made me kind of like go on Twitter and start tweeting, sometimes not the most thoughtful tweets, but just sort of like angry, frankly. But now, I mean, after all this, I've kind of like sifted through so many things, and I have 3 kind of principles, I would say, about this whole topic that I really am firm in. Like, these are my axioms. Like, this is where the discussion has to start for me, and I'm interested to actually hear your reaction to this. So
what are they?
So number 1 is the same exact number 1 principle that the trans activists have, in fact, which is trans people, like all people, are worthy of dignity, respect, love, care, you know, lives free of discrimination and fear for being trans. My second axiom is the opposite to the second axiom of what I would imagine of the trans activists, which is that human beings can never change sex. A man can never become a woman. A male can never become a female. For me, there's no nuance in that there's like a male woman, because I know some people have that where they're like, okay, well, they're socially a woman, but they're biological. No, like trans women are trans women is how I see it. trans men are trans men. They're still biologically the sex they were born. And that's an important part of their trans identity, as many trans people point out and then get called TERFs. So that's my second principle, because that's scientific. That is just like, I am going to go with enlightenment values like science and reason and logic. And the third one is just that everything else after that has to be discussed. It has to be talked about. We have to have open discussions. Those are the only two things that I can say, like, I know for sure. I will never change my mind on those things. I mean, if there's science that says like we can change our sex, then I'll have to listen to it, but there's not. And everything else after that is opinions. You know, sports, bathrooms, changing rooms, everything that comes after that can be argued. I have my opinions about it. Like, for example, I think sports should be sex segregated, but I'm willing to actually be persuaded. If there was a persuasive enough argument, I would definitely listen to it. I would change my mind if it was persuasive enough. But that's the thing, is we have to, everything that follows from those first two axioms, they have to be discussed. They can't just be pushed through.
Yeah, I agree with those pretty much. I think there's, some maybe like very fine points of nuance where we disagree, but the overall gist that yes, number one, like all humans deserve dignity and respect, regardless of whether we politically agree with them or not. Exactly. And number two, sexual dimorphism exists in human beings and you cannot change sex. Yeah. I agree. And yeah, I think you're right that after that, there are good arguments on many sides of anything else. And like you, I also have my opinions. I think they pretty generally line up with what you would expect from someone who calls themselves gender critical. But I agree that those are the debates that are worth having. And unfortunately, we are stuck as a culture in this debate on number two, which is whether or not humans can change sex. And we can say all day long that humans can't change sex, but that we can say this isn't a debate, but at the end of the day, like there is a debate happening about it. And true. I think that that's pretty just ridiculous in and of itself, that we're even at the point where we're debating this thing.
I know.
And when we try to say, well, okay, we can talk about, what things should be sex segregated and what things shouldn't. We can talk about when you should use pronouns or preferred pronouns or whatever. We can talk about all of that, but you just have to start from the basis of understanding that a male is a male is a male, and and vice versa. Exactly. But unfortunately, we can't. And I think that that's intentional. I think that trans activists keep the conversation there, because they know that once they cede the ground that someone who calls themselves a trans woman, a man who identifies as a woman, is a male, that they're going to lose those other arguments because they're mostly just logical fallacies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so I'm curious about what the nuances are that you disagree with. I want to hear them. But also, I just wanted to say, have you seen, I think it was just today that we're filming on January 14th, January 14th, Chase Strangio had a little tweet storm today about how, yes, trans women and girls are biologically female. So this is Chase Strangio of the ACLU tweeting these things.
Yeah. Yes, that's the American Civil Liberties Union, folks. And this is the same Chase who we might remember from supporting book burnings or bannings, I forget exactly which it was, of Abigail Schreier's book, saying that getting that book banned was a hill that Chase was prepared to die on.
Yeah, well, he said stopping the circulation of this book and these ideas is a hill I am willing to die on.
Yes, that's what it was. So I'm not surprised to see this coming from Chase, but it's always disappointing to me that the ACLU, an organization which I normally and in almost every other issue really agree with and support, and used to be a donor to, is, purporting to, support these sorts of ideas. It's really disappointing.
So I think this would be fascinating to tease out. What are the things that you might disagree with my axioms? Because, I've been thinking about those lately, but that's like, I keep running them by people because I want to hear people's, reactions to them.
Yeah. So I don't know if I would say I'm actually disagreeing with your axioms. I think that from what I understand of what you're trying to communicate from what you said on each of them, I agree with the same points. I think my disagreements would be on maybe some of the nuances of how you said it. And I know you're just talking off the cuff, so maybe even like you aren't thinking right now about the tiny little wording implications. But for example, I don't necessarily agree with referring to men who identify as women as trans women, because I think that this makes them a subset of women to some degree. I think it also obscures the reality that it's a man who's calling himself a woman. But again, I think that that actually is part of number 3, your third axiom, the idea that anything after the biological reality is up for debate. Like I'll debate about, should we use the term trans woman, or I'll debate about preferred pronouns, which I noticed that you use. So like those are things I think we can debate on. So I don't think I'm disagreeing with your axioms, just on how you said them.
That makes sense. And that's, I think, really valuable that we kind of represent those different nuances, because I do use the preferred pronouns a lot of the time. And I like respect the word trans woman and trans men as words that I, currently find that to be legit, like good to use, helpful. But, and I also do it because I think it allows some people to listen rather than just reject what I'm saying right off the bat. But I think it's good that we're showing like that there's different views within gender critical, because we don't have all the same views on things. Like we definitely agree on the basics for sure. And I think I see the world in a lot of the same ways that you do. But we have those little differences.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that we can work together towards a common goal, even when we disagree on some of these fine points. I mean, I think we see a lot of infighting in the gender critical movement around things like this, around should we use preferred pronouns or not. And, I do think it's a debate worth having. And I really am interested in seeing both sides of this. I think I've seen strong arguments in both sides, and I ended up landing where I did. But it's just an example of something that we tend to get wrapped up in these little things, when the reality is that the war right now is happening on your axiom number 2, on the biological reality of it's science denial, it's the denial of material reality.
If you say it, you get crushed.
Yes, the right to debate. Yes, absolutely. The right to debate is just gone. They've blown past number 2, saying like, nope, that's not true, and therefore we don't have to debate anything in number 3, instead of saying because number 2 is true, therefore it's worth having the debates on number 3.
Yeah, precisely. And all my, everything other than those 2 principles for me, I have my opinions. They're pretty strong in some cases, but I recognize that they're opinions, and just like you just said, like I'm willing to have those conversations.
Yeah, I agree.
So if you guys want to let us know what you think, we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you think about all this. If you have peak trans stories, let us know in the comments here, or you can email us at submit@xyz. I'll insert it on the screen.
Submit@identitycrisis.xyz.
That's the one. We'll see you guys next time.
Thank you all so much for tuning in.